I hope that you're enjoying this study in the book of First Thessalonians. And we've been looking at history for the last two sessions that we've been talking to you, the history of the church of Thessalonica. And we're gonna move on today into the content of the letter. But let me just say this. The church at Thessalonica was 3 weeks old when the Apostle Paul and Silas left the church. Chapter 17 of the book of Acts, verse number 10 says this, "And the brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. And when they arrived, they went into the synagogue of the Jews." What happened? After 3 weeks, trouble happened in Thessalonica. Not only was there trouble, but the Bible tells us that Jason had made a pledge to them. Now, we don't know what the pledge was that Jason made. You know, some people speculate and they say, well, Jason said we won't preach the gospel. I don't know if that's true or not. Jason was a leader in the synagogue. Maybe he made that pledge. Maybe it was a different pledge. We don't know. All we know is that the disciples, that the new converts came to Paul and Silas and said to them, you know what, guys, you got to get out of here. Now, I want you to notice here, it wasn't Paul and Silas's idea. All they were doing is following the advice of the believers, of these new converts. I'm remembering a time where we were up in the mountains in Mexico, and we heard that a man was coming to shoot the Americans. And the word came up, the Americans need to leave. And you know what? We took the advice of the nationals and we left. And we actually passed the man carrying a gun as we went up the trail, and God delivered us. But you know what? The Apostle Paul and Silas, they didn't sit there saying, you know what, we are superiors to you. We're not going to listen to your stuff. No, what Paul and Silas did is they listened and they moved on. You know what? When things get rough, you need to get counsel from other believers, and then you just need to move on like Paul and Silas. I don't know why I said that. It's for somebody out there today. Let's look at the content of the book of First Thessalonians. The letter was written much like a report. In other words, the Apostle Paul is reporting to them, and he has received a report from Timothy about them. And so Paul is reporting to them, but he's also receiving and correcting something that needed to be corrected in the church at Thessalonica. There's a list of good things and bad things. How many know what one of the customary things that the Apostle Paul does is he writes and he praises the people first, and then he lets down the hammer and he corrects them. And I think that's a great way of doing things. Praise them first, build them up first, and then correct them. The letter was written only a few months after Paul had first visited them. The conditions of the church are very good. When Timothy came back and he finds Paul in the city of Corinth, Timothy brings to him a tremendous report. And in the book of First Thessalonians, the 4th chapter, verse 9, the Apostle Paul writes this, and it has to deal with that report. And he says this, "Now as to the love of the brethren, I have no need for anyone to write to you, for you yourselves are taught by God to love one another." You see, this church was a church of love. This church was a church of love, and this kind of love, it didn't come because some preacher was up there preaching on love and giving you 10 steps to loving your neighbor. You know what it was happening? The Holy Spirit was there. God was there teaching them. Now again, who are these people? There's a few Jewish people. There's a whole bunch of Greek people who know nothing about God whatsoever. At least this God. And then there's some influential women, and they were probably also Greek women that were influential in the community, but the Holy Spirit himself is teaching them to love one another. This church at Thessalonica, one of its characteristics was to love. And so Paul brings this out in this letter. Their testimony is being heard about in Macedonia and Achaia. Now, if we had a map, we could show you these different places and their testimony, what God was doing in their midst was spreading. People were hearing about this church at Thessalonica. And at this time, this church is probably only 4 months old. But yet, people are hearing about this church. Why? Because this church was moving in and through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. God was moving in this church, and people were hearing, you know what? The best advertisement for your church is that God's there, and God's moving, and he's changing lives, and people who are unlovable are being loved. So we hear, Paul is hearing a good report, but Paul has also heard a bad report. And so Paul writes to the Thessalonians and he gives them correction, and we find that correction starting in about the 4th chapter, and we're going to look into that as we study this book of First Thessalonians. So the first part of the book of First Thessalonians, it's Paul's greeting. Paul talks about his character. Paul talks about their struggles. Paul talks about giving to Timothy, the giving that they gave to Timothy for them. You know, the church of Thessalonica, you know what it did? It supported Paul's ministry. Wow. A church that's maybe 4 months old is now supporting the Apostle Paul. They've taken an offering for Paul. They gave it to Timothy. Timothy brings it into Corinth and says, hey, Paul, you don't have to make tents anymore. You can go preach now. Wow. What a church. But Paul then goes and he begins to exhort them. And he exhorts them about sexual immorality. He exhorts them about laziness. He exhorts them about those who have died. How many of you know there's a lot of weird ideas about dead people? Where they go, you know, people still believe that there's ghosts. Well, there is a spiritual being, and it's called a demon, a familiar spirit that represents itself as being a dead loved one. And then the last part of First Thessalonians, we talk about the second coming of Jesus. Wow. What a beautiful encouragement to these people that are being persecuted. And then the very last part of First Thessalonians talks about other exhortations or other pieces of advice that the Apostle Paul gives, like pray without ceasing. You know what? We're done. Our time is up for today. God bless you until we speak to you again.